Hey everyone, it's Kat and Chris back at our channel. We're here checking out the XRT. We just installed the new ESC and the big motor. So let's pop the hood and check it out. Man. So Chris, what did you do?
Well, we did a little bit of everything, a little bit of ketchup here, a little bit of mustard over there, you know?
Well, can I just say this is the cleanest setup ever?
All right, well, thank you for the compliments. I tried hard, okay? I tried to keep it nice, clean setup. Look at this thing.
And look at that carbon fiber.
Ooh, that carbon. You guys seen that thing right there?
We
got carbon.
Beautiful.
I mean, side profile, look at that. That motor, it just sits right. It really does.
Look at that clearance though. It's like just a teeny bit.
Yeah, it's right on there. So let's get to it. Let's talk about this thing, get down to business and see how exactly we installed it.
Oh yeah.
There it is. Look at this thing. Yep, we got the motor mounted. We've got the speed controller mounted. We've got a nice clean setup. Now, I'll go over exactly what I did in just a second, but you can kind of take a look here and see it for yourself, exactly the setup we've got going on here. We'll see how it stands up to actually getting bashed and going through some G-forces to see whether or not it really holds up. Let me just show you the original motor, because now it's out of the truck. I've still got the heat sink and all the fans attached to it. And of course, the whole V8 engine looking thing was pretty sweet. I'm not going to run any fans on this motor for two reasons. The first reason is I don't feel like it. And the second reason is I don't think it's going to need it because this truck is pretty lightweight and this motor is overkill. So I don't think it's going to get very hot. But if it does, maybe I'll put a fan on it. But for right now, I'm just going to leave it as is. Now, if you look at the stock motor compared to this motor, you can see we've got quite the difference here, okay? Big boy, little boy. I did have a question. Somebody asked in the last video why I don't just run a Max 6 with the stock motor and gear it up. The reason I'm not gonna do that is because I've done that probably 50 times already in X-maxes, and a lot of people have already done that in the XRT. I know what that setup is like, and I think there's a lot of data as far as performance you get, and that's a really, really great setup, and definitely do that if that's what you want to do. I want to go with a big motor just because I haven't seen a whole lot of people doing it. I want to do it for myself to see exactly what was involved so I can advise people if they want to do it to their truck, exactly what has to be done to fit this motor and this speed controller. So obviously, it probably would have been easier just to put a Max 6 with the stock motor, but that's no fun. So we went with this route. First things first, as you can tell, this is not the stock motor mount. This motor mount is designed to fit the bigger motor cans like the Castle 2028 style. It still fits stock motors if you want to use this motor mount. Now, I just used this motor mount. I didn't have to use any risers like you might have to do on an x-maxx, because on the x-maxx, it's a little bit more, like the chassis is a different shape, and this is further down inside the chassis, so you need risers in order to get the right gearing. But in this case, I just used this mount as is. And if you want to know where to get this mount, well, here I pull it up on our website. This is the mount. It's from Bauhaus, RC, x-maxx, SVD, big bore, mount, black. That's the one. Now, it comes with this nifty little pipe clamp. I'm not really sure how much the pipe clamp really does, but it should make the setup a lot more rigid, because otherwise it's only mounted at the front of here, at the front of the motor, so you would have some room for flex. So this pipe clamp really keeps it secure to the bottom of the motor mount, so that should be nice. Moving on to the speed controller, I got some questions as to why I didn't use the Castle speed controller, and there's two reasons for that. The first reason is, well, I sold the Castle speed controller to a customer earlier that morning, so I didn't really have one, but also, I prefer the shape of the Hobbywing speed controllers. They're a little bit more square. The Castle ones are kind of like rectangular, and they're like thinner or more narrow, like in the center, and it was kind of like an awkward shape. And initially, I was going to run the speed controller sideways, like in this space right here where I ended up putting the receiver, but it wasn't really working out, and I didn't want to have to pull the Dremel out to try to flatten all of this in order to actually mount it. Now, before we talk too much about the speed controller, more about the motor setup. As you can see on the bottom here, I did some Dremel work. Now, there's a little bit of a flange that kind of looks like the flange up here that's running across the chassis, and the motor wasn't able to sit flat on the chassis with that little piece there. So I took the Dremel out and I flattened it and made it flush. I just took a little bit of that material off of there just to make it flat. It wasn't anything really structural, so it shouldn't affect the rigidity of the chassis whatsoever, but I needed to do that in order to accommodate for the larger size can because it's actually very close to the chassis. As you can see on the bottom there, can't even really get a finger under there whatsoever. It's just, maybe 3 millimeters above, so I had to do that. So just keep that in mind if you're gonna go with this motor. The speed controller, I used a carbon fiber mount here, and I actually mounted it where the receiver box usually is, and I used the mounting points of that receiver box to actually secure the carbon mount, to secure the speed controller. And like I said, initially I had the speed controller sideways over here, but I just didn't like that the wires were off to the side. I prefer a really clean setup, and I really wanted the speed controller to be lengthwise like this in the front of the truck. After an entire day of consideration, I decided if I had some sort of plate that I could mount and secure it to somewhere where there was already an existing mounting hole, that would be ideal, and I came up with this setup, and I actually really like the way it looks. You can kind of see what it looks like on that side. I got the antenna over here. I got some wires on the other side here. I'll probably end up securing this a little bit better. I've got the switch on the front. Now, obviously, with the receiver mounted like this, exposed, this truck is no longer waterproof because these receivers on their own are not waterproof. I never run my truck in water, and I don't plan on it. If it does get a little bit wet and the receiver gets wet and burns out, I'll just have to get another receiver, but I don't really mind. I think it's gonna be okay for a while, honestly. I don't really think it's gonna be a huge deal. So we've got the receiver mounted right in the center there. The wire for the steering servo was conveniently right in this area already, so I didn't need any servo extensions. It just plugged right on in. So that was pretty sweet. Now, if you're noticing, there's only one connector on the speed controller. Obviously, I'm gonna run 2 batteries. I'm just gonna run a series adapter, okay? Obviously, this is lengthening the wires on the speed controller, which to some people isn't ideal. Now, again, I think this system is really not going to be having a hard time in this setup, so I'm not really concerned about voltage ripple or voltage sag or anything really like that. So I think it's gonna be all right with the extra wiring on here. If it ends up being a problem, I'll just end up soldering in a Y harness into the existing wire that's on the speed controller. But for right now, I've just got the single on here, and we're gonna run it that way. So we're talking about the gearing, all right? We've got the pinion gear, we've got the spur gear. The stock spur gear is a 50, and it didn't fit right because it was just a little bit too big for how big I want to go on the pinion gear. So I put the 46 on here, and then we're running an Arma 8mm bore pinion. I don't really remember what size it is. If I can look at it, it is a 26. Does that say 26? 26. It is a 26. Now, the gearing will definitely be adjusted once we run it for the first time to see how it handles, how much speed it has, how much power it has. I'm just doing this so that way we can test it, see whether or not we like that. It might be close to what we're gonna keep. I'm not exactly sure. Now, obviously, there's a million and one things you can do to the transmission, specifically the cush drive, the input shaft, that a lot of guys do on x-maxxes, and I'm sure everybody's gonna enlighten me in the comments about what their opinion is on the input shaft, the Traxxas spur gears, the plastic cover for the input shaft here. It's endless, the amount of things you can do to try to beef up the truck in order to handle this amount of power. What I'm going to do is absolutely nothing. We're just gonna bolt on the motor, bolt on the speed controller, throw in the batteries, okay? I'm trying to make this thing as stock as possible so we can see what exactly happens with this amount of power in a pretty much stock truck. This truck has never been run, so it's gonna have the best chance possible in order to survive the power. I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen. We'll probably end up breaking a few things if we're hard enough on it, but we also might not, and I wanna take that as a baseline so that everybody knows exactly what would happen if you put this kind of power in a stock XRT. Because if you're building something like this and you start adding on a bunch of other parts like aluminum covers over here, this is pretty common, this little gray cover here to make this aluminum rather than the plastic one, and then putting hardened steel gears on the spur, putting maybe mod 1.5 gears rather than the mod 1 that comes with it. I'm just gonna run the mod 1 and see what happens, because I think that if we have a nice clean setup where the motor mesh is set properly, everything's new, none of the bearings are worn out or anything like that, and we're not just throwing parts at it where we don't know whether or not it was just fine before and putting the new parts on are actually what caused the issue. This way we're going to know for sure whether or not things need to be upgraded. So that's what we're going to do, and that's why I'm just going to leave this truck pretty much as is for the time being, obviously besides the giant motor system. I want a truck that has standing backflip power, that's just like angry and just can really just, like we talked about, alter the Earth's rotation. As soon as we hit that power, this thing literally just moves out. All right, this thing, all the mail, it's all getting hauled. Hauling mail will be this truck's specialty, okay? If anybody knows what that means, because I sure don't. The next video will be literally running this truck. The only thing right now, obviously, I have some batteries here that I don't really want to use. I'd rather wait for the batteries that I have, and I still need to calibrate the speed controller to the radio system. Everybody will be right here with me the first time we power this thing up, send the power to the wheels, and then take it outside and see what happens. That's going to be in the next video in part 2. I have no idea what's going to happen. Let me know what you think is going to happen the second we put some power into this thing, how fast you think it's going to be. I remember something. So I told you I would tell you if there was anything weird going on with this setup. Obviously, the mixing matching with the Castle and the Hobby Wing did have a little bit, I wouldn't say it was an issue, but the bullets on the Castle motor are not 6.5 millimeter like they are on the speed controller. They're 8 millimeters. They're giant. And I'm not really sure why, but it's kind of silly. On the Castle speed controller, when you look at them next to each other, they both come with 8 gauge on the wires here, but the Castle 8 gauge is like, it looks like 10 gauge, and then the Hobby Wing 8 gauge definitely looks like 8 gauge, but then on the Castle motor, it had 8 millimeter bullets, but the Hobby Wing ESC had 6.5 millimeter bullets, so they were like beefier in certain areas and not as beefy in other areas. They're like kind of opposite of each other, which didn't really make any sense to me. But just so you're aware, if you do get this motor and for whatever reason you want to run the Hobby Wing because the Hobby Wing is going to be pretty nasty, and in mind, you will need to solder new bullets on the motor because they're too big to fit on the stock Hobby Wing bullets. So if you went with the Castle XLX2, you wouldn't have to do that, but you wouldn't have this super nice and thick 8 gauge on the main wire leads here. Not that that's really going to make a huge difference in the situation. For the future of this truck, though, obviously we're going to run it the way it is. I'm still running the Traxxas receiver, which it's unknown really exactly whether it can handle high voltage or not because the stock servos apparently can. So the receivers probably can, but you probably void every single warranty possible. But obviously with a build like this, warranty went out the window the second we took it out of the box. So we're not really worried about that. There was one other little thing, okay? This is very simple, but this should honestly, whether you have a stock truck or not, you should really do this. I'm not really sure if you can see, but if you look in these holes, which are incredibly deep and dark, I do have the Traxxas flat aluminum washers inside there rather than just the regular motor bolts. Obviously with a motor this heavy, these screws, the only thing they're really pressed up against is the plastic chassis. And because this motor's so heavy, I wanted to spread out the weight a little bit more on the heads of the screws. So I used the Traxxas washers, which they sell, which is a direct fit for the x-maxx and the XRT. So you can actually torque them down a little bit more without worrying about them pulling through the chassis. So that's definitely something I'd recommend doing. Even on a stock truck, it definitely helps the rigidity of the motor mount, which will significantly reduce the risk of stripping out gears because of motors shifting or anything like that. With the cover on, you would have no idea that this truck, I'm showing up to the, the RC truck meet, like, hey man, my XRT is totally stock. I know what you mean, like literally box stock. I didn't do anything to it. I mean, if you look through the hood here, you can kind of sort of see a little bit of Castle peeking through, maybe up there. Just barely, but I'm not taking the cover off, man. This thing, it's totally just, I don't know what to tell you. It's just really fast, Yeah, there you have it. This is the XRT with the motor mounted up. I mean, look at that thing. When you look at it from like a side profile, It's just such a clean setup. I'm really, really liking it, and I'm really glad that I got the speed controller more in line with the motor like this so I could have the motor wires. You know, just me personally, I like having a really nice clean setup like that. I think it goes a long way. And especially with these vents, you know, cooling the air, it's gonna go directly over the speed controller, over the motor. Honestly, it's almost like it was made for it. So I will see you in the next video when we get this thing running and actually put the power to the ground. Let me know in the comments what you think it's gonna do, top speed-wise, power-wise. Will it do standing backflips? Maybe if I take the wheelie bar off, maybe it'll do some sort of acrobatics. I hope you enjoyed today's video about the XRT. This is just part one. Part two will be running this truck. We're gonna see exactly how fast it is. Let me know down in the comments how fast you think this thing's gonna be, if you think it's gonna break 100 miles per hour, 200 miles per hour, land speed record, altering the Earth's rotation, and destroying everything in its path. I think some exciting things are probably gonna happen. Things might shred, things might not shred, things might actually go perfectly fine. This might be the ultimate setup. We will see you in the next video, and we will let you know what happens. Let's do it.